Hello, everybody. I'm David Baines. I'm the Chief Finance and Operating Officer of IP Group, and I'm here to welcome you to the very last of IP Group's 20 and 21 webinars. This is a series of webinars that run through the year to celebrate 20 years of IP Group. Now, as quite a lot of you will know, this was meant to be a hybrid event. We were hoping to coincide this event with the opening of our new office. And the good news is we have got a new office in King's Cross that we were hoping to be presenting from. Unfortunately, because of the trials and tribulations of COVID, we decided at the last moment that actually trying to hold a live event, particularly having had a few instances of COVID breaking out in the group, probably wouldn't work. So unfortunately today, we don't have sort of 100 friends and family and staff and former staff with us in person as we'd hoped. But the good news is that hopefully in another month or so, we will be able to have some kind of event to actually formally celebrate the opening of the office. And I'm sure we'll all get together again then to celebrate in person. These webinar series mainly to date have been about the first 20 years. We've been looking back at all the things that we've achieved in IP Group. And today is slightly different. And we're getting to look forward to the next 20 years. Where's IP Group going to be in 20 years? What are we going to achieve and what are we going to look like? The format for the day is, as before in these series, there are a number of presentations. So in most cases, we're going to actually keep questions to the end, just to keep to the agenda. One exception, Sam, who be presenting on the Life Science Fund, is actually dual tasking. I believe he's doing a board at the same time. So he will actually take questions at the same time as his presentation. So you'll see that bit when it comes. But without further ado, and just as your last point, if you do want to ask questions, do them on the chat function as always, and then I can raise them with the team at the end when we get to the end of the webinar. But now, without further ado, I'll hand you over to our chairman, Sir Douglas Flint, to open the meeting. Many thanks.
David, thanks very much. And let me add my welcome and say what a privilege it is to be part of this this celebration and this opportunity to gaze into the future. And I guess that's something that IP Group has been doing since the earliest days. As I thought about what I might say today, I went back in all the filings that have been made, right back to the earliest filings as a public company. And what was extraordinary, or not extraordinary for this company, but for others, is the clarity of message, the clarity of purpose, and the vision of the company and its mission has been the same for the entire 20 years, which is remarkable. I've had the privilege of being chairman for 3 years now. I know that for the first 3 years, the company had 3 chairmen, so so far so good. But it's a company that in 20 years has been through more events and experiences than many companies much larger would go through in a much longer period of time. From M&A transactions to changes in shareholder structures, volatility and asset valuations, volatility in P&L, different partners, portfolio companies rising and falling and rising again, and times of cash famine, and now happily times of cash feast. And the other thing that has been extraordinarily consistent throughout this period, and really the single largest factor that attracted me to join this amazing company, was the passion of the people towards what this company was about, the mission, the purpose, the ability to evolve great ideas into world-changing businesses. And as the company has matured, this family, and I really think of it as a family, and for all of those on the webinar who've been part of the story as investors, as shareholders, as former employees, as partners, it's been an incredible journey, getting companies from the earliest stages to maturity and seeing them grow up through the difficult teenage years to being mature adults and beginning to have family of their own. The last 2 years, I think, have been particularly illustrative of the maturity of the group, with an extraordinary number of companies coming through, realizations, generating a fantastic amount of cash, and of course the ultimate IPO of Oxford Nanopore. I think those of us who have the privilege of being involved with the company today owe such an enormous debt of gratitude to everyone that's been part of the journey and is still part of the journey. Alan, you've been with it for the whole time. Greg, Sam, Mark, DB, an extraordinary period of service. Rob, we're going to hear from you about some of the most exciting things following from COP26. I'm thrilled to have been part of it for a very small part, but even more excited to see what this great team will do going forward. So without any more from me, let me pass over to Greg. Greg.
Thank you very much, Douglas. In the time-honored tradition, I will just share my screen. Okay, yeah, so as I said, thanks very much, Sir Douglas, and thank you everyone for dialing in. As DB mentioned, we had really hoped this would be a hybrid event, the final one in our 20 and 21 series, and we'd be broadcasting online from what will soon be our new London head office in King's Cross. But unfortunately, as has been the case for many businesses across the UK and the world over the recent past, we've had to be agile and flexible to cope with the challenges and indeed at times opportunities that COVID has thrown at us all over the last couple of years. And so I'd obviously like to say thank you very much to the team for seamlessly shifting us across to the digital world. I'd like to say sorry to all of those whose plans have been disrupted, and of course get well soon to our colleague and their family who tested positive a couple of days ago. There will of course be many other opportunities for colleagues, former colleagues, portfolio companies, and investors to visit us again in due course, and we really look forward to welcoming you all in the not too distant future. So on the subject of the future, today I and the team wanted to share with you a couple of reflections, but really why we're so excited about the next stage of the journey for IP Group. And firstly, although the vast majority of you will have known me in my previous role as CFO, this is the first time I'm talking to a number of you as IP Group's CEO. I'm incredibly proud of IP Group and both humbled and excited by the opportunity to lead the business. I'm incredibly grateful to Alan and Mike as they move on to their next challenges. But as you will hopefully all have seen from the announcements, I'm not letting them go without agreeing to some form of ongoing access for the group to their vast experience and love for what we all do together at IP Group, what we've done for the past 20 years, and certainly what I envisage us doing for many more years to come. And that is the art of finding, growing, and backing companies that address global markets, that address some of the world's biggest and most pressing challenges, and therefore address some of the world's biggest opportunities to create impact and financial returns. So I thought I should probably introduce my background for those that don't know me. I'm a scientist, I'm a mathematician by educational background, I'm an accountant by formal training. I spent some time helping to grow a fund of hedge funds investment business. And for the past 13 years, I've been helping to grow and lead one of the most exciting, meaningful, and purposeful businesses that, to be honest, many people outside of this room have never heard of. So certainly one of my aims over the coming months and years is to improve that, to change it with a wider investment and shareholder community audience, with entrepreneurs and leaders in the fields and countries in which we operate, and of course with the talent that we will need to attract and retain to make what is already a business with a really strong track record into one that really fulfills its potential. And how did I end up doing this amazing job? You know, one of the best jobs in the world, in my opinion. Well, part of it can be attributed to this. This, as some of you will know, is the USS Starship Enterprise. This is a version from 1986, so a little bit further back than IP Group's 20-year history. But the many adventurous missions undertaken by the crew of the Enterprise on Star Trek, they were pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, pioneering exploration. They were one of the many influences that took my education, my career into science and ultimately into this role. And I see IP Group as a pioneer in many ways, boldly going into places that no one, or certainly not many in the investing world, had gone before. And let's be honest, at times this was tough, really tough. I remember one of the first things I had to navigate upon joining IP Group in 2008 was the financial crisis, locking up the proverbial checkbook and encouraging our businesses to survive for longer on less. Now, many of the people here today virtually lived through all those challenges. Sam, who you're going to hear from shortly, who now runs our life sciences partnership in the UK, he faced the challenge of almost having to close down what was then Modern Biosciences, now Istesso, our second most valuable holding. I remember the backing that the Numis team and a handful of pretty pioneering UK investors gave us in 2011, when we first moved our strategy from sort of supporting our businesses further as a cornerstone investor beyond Series A, and I moved at that time to be CFO. Rob, you're going to hear from him later, as Douglas said, on COP26. He'd been pioneering as a clean tech investor for the group, and clean tech investing was definitely way out of favor and way out of fashion compared to today. But he will tell the story, if you talk to him, about the rescue of Ceres Power at a £1 million valuation, a £1 million valuation in 2012. And the fact that pretty much everyone thought he and we were crazy to be backing a fuel cell business, and one that the technology had failed, no less. So I remember sitting on the IC for that business. We struggled to get co-investors alongside us for a small 10 million follow-on round in 2013, and another for 20 million in 2015. But we overcame that adversity, and we did weather the storm. And many people who are here today played their part in that, and I want to recognize them for doing so. So this is a really experienced team that's weathered many storms so far, and that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited about the next stage of this journey. Now, the second reason I'm excited about the future is at least in part down to this image. This is fast forward 30 years from that version of the enterprise, and in 2016, which is almost 5 years ago to the day, actually, I was making one of a number of trips across to the US as we were building and incubating IP Group Inc. Now, with IP Group Inc., we believe we've created a vehicle that is fit to be the leader in the US market. We've got blue chip, long-term local capital providers alongside us, and we've got a great team with years of institutional knowledge. And look, given the markets and the research output in the US, this should be an order of magnitude bigger than the UK business. But anyway, as I was sat on the runway, for many a sort of a distant memory these days, really, I spotted this in the In-Flight magazine, and it's a tech column written by a chap called Ben Hammersley. He's a futures consultant, which I guess is maybe a little bit like how you might describe the people in IP Group. And the image in the middle there is of a chap called Bones, and he was the ship's doctor. And in his hand, he's holding a tricorder. This is the handheld device that Bones and others use to identify new extraterrestrial life, or typically extraterrestrial ailments that were affecting the crew at the time. And this article was prompted by an astronaut called Kate Rubins, who had taken a MinION handheld sequencing device up onto the International Space Station to study the genetic changes caused by microgravity and radiation. And of course, fast forward a further 5 years to 2021, and we are genuinely delighted by the recent successful IPO of Oxford Nanopore. Continues to go from strength to strength, and having known and worked with the guys, with the team for more than 10 years now, I'm so proud of what they've achieved, but I also know the ambition and the drive and the opportunity that they are all pursuing, and what that can mean from a value and an impact point of view. So that's led to what is shaping up to be a second successive year of record returns for IP Group. And so this contributes to a long-term track record of more than 15 years of annualized double-digit growth in our net assets per share since we came to market back in 2003 on AIM. And you'll see here I've put on the right-hand side 150p per share. That's an indicative number taking into account Nanopore and a couple of the other announced transactions over the period since the half-year results. So it's an indicative number, but 150 pence per share. And that represents about 7x growth and an annualized double-digit returns. And we're confident that the group can continue to deliver on this target of double-digit growth. But I think, you know, it should really be seen as a baseline of what we're trying to target. That's funny, reflecting on conversations with many of our shareholders over the years, that this sort of concept of approving the model has sometimes felt a little bit like the search for Spock, to use another Trekkie reference. But finally, having now created 3 multi-billion-pound companies in the IP Group portfolio, it feels to me that, you know, we might have just finally found him. And so the role of IP Group in the development of Oxford Nanopore and of Ceres Power has come about, I think, from a pretty unique combination of expertise and experience. That's expertise in accessing early stage innovation, expertise in deep scientific and sectoral disciplines, expertise in helping to build and grow more than 300 businesses, and that's teams, that's commercial, that's IP, and crucially, expertise in accessing long-term capital. And that's been through our pioneering listed permanent capital model, but also through private pools of capital, such as the Australian super funds and big US foundations. So this track record, which, you know, we believe this is competitive with other major asset classes over this period, and this combination of expertise and experience is that's the second reason why I'm excited by the future. Now, the third reason, and probably the key one really, is I think probably best described by this quote from Gordon, the CEO of Oxford Nanopore, and he was talking about the prospects for Oxford Nanopore just as they came to the market at IPO. And he said, "We believe we are only in the foothills of a long and exciting journey." Only in the foothills. And I believe this is true for IP Group too. And why do I think this? Well, you know, part of it is down to the big themes that we're aligned with as a business. And in seeking to create big businesses that address big global markets, we can create huge impact and play a part in building the future that we want to be a part of. Now, look, lots is written about themes, secular growth themes, thematic investing. So look, we're not doing anything too out there here. But interestingly, when you look at the publications predicting the big trends, we find that our collective insight and experience is actually playing into these trends already, and quite often before they even become trends. Clean tech, or maybe even climate tech, as it's sometimes called now, is something we've been doing since 2004, even when it was out of favor, as exemplified by that story about Ceres that I mentioned earlier. Bank of America have an excellent thematics team, and they highlighted in a recent report a whole bunch of moonshot technologies for the next decade or two. Guess what? We've already got a number of portfolio companies in themes like EV tolls, which is flying electric cars to you and I, carbon capture, next generation networks, and actually curing rather than treating disease. Now, another example is this report from the UN's Economist Network. And this is a recent report that focuses on 5 of the big megatrends that they identify as defining the course of progress towards sustainable development. Now, the 3 that I've put in color on here are particularly aligned with the sectors in which we operate. And Sam, Mark, and Rob will be covering each of these areas in a little bit more detail. So my job is just to sort of give you a taster of the opportunity here. So firstly, climate. I was up in Glasgow for a few days last week with our clean tech team. And I think most attendees there recognized a bit of a visible shift away from a debate around sort of direction of travel, i.e. it's not really a debate anymore that climate change needs to happen. It's more a debate around pace of travel, i.e., can we move quickly enough? Lombard Odier, who were there, they described a profound economic transformation brought about by the climate transition, perhaps the most significant economic transformation in history. Bank of America predicts a 5 trillion annual investment requirement over the next 30 years. That's more than the US tax take. So the opportunity to have a really meaningful impact and generate significant financial returns is there. And I believe we've got the team and the portfolio to take advantage of that. The second area is this war against disease against a backdrop of an aging world. We've seen some of the thematics predicting immortality by the end of the decade. That may or may not be achievable, but definitely what's clear is that healthcare, and particularly a shift to better understanding of disease, treatment, prevention, and potentially cure, is a trend that's always been a core competence of us here at IP Group. The numbers are significant, whichever lens you look at. And this is an estimate here from Deloitte of the annual spend on healthcare just in the US. It's getting on for about 20% of their GDP. But what's quite interesting is that the proportion spent on prevention and cure is a fraction of this. It's, some people think it's as low as sort of 3 or 5%. And that's an area where we believe through businesses such as Estesso, who I mentioned earlier, have an opportunity for significant impact and returns, and the team to deliver on it. And then thirdly, I couldn't go through this without mentioning digitization. Everybody in this virtual room today is clearly impacted by these trends. Mark and team focus on a number of sub areas here, such as cybersecurity, ubiquity in communications, and new types of computing, such as quantum and anthropomorphic. Even one of these, and Mark will go into this a little bit more, such as cyber, is a multi-trillion cost and therefore a huge opportunity. And in that space alone, we've got exciting companies such as Garrison, Featurespace. So, having become CEO of IP Group at this point in our journey, 20 years of organizational experience and insight, cash balance of more than 300 million, 15 years of double-digit growth and a team and a portfolio highly aligned around these key megatrends, I believe that supports that we are indeed only in the foothills. It's taken us 20 years to help create 3 unicorns. Now, interestingly, Larry Fink said just last month, a couple of weeks ago, that he believes the next 1,000 unicorns, 1,000 multi-billion value companies will be in climate technology. So I don't think it's at all unreasonable that we would help to build and create our next 10 unicorns over the next 10 years. And maybe I'm being conservative. Now, this talk's been about the reasons why I believe we're only just in the foothills with IP Group, and including that we've got this experienced team that's been through storms, this track record built on expertise, and the opportunity in these mega trends that we're aligned to is it's huge. But I should also say, I and the team plan to come and speak to shareholders with a clear vision, a clear strategy, and with KPIs covering both impact and financial returns in the new year. Now, I just want to finish by sharing a short video that I saw recently that moved me. It was shared on Twitter, and it linked back to the very first image that I showed you of the Enterprise. And some of you may have seen this. You might have seen William Shatner, who was one of the most famous captains of the Enterprise, Jim Kirk. He recently took part in a suborbital flight at the ripe old age of 90. Now, look, I know you could definitely argue about the sort of the moral and the environmental issues around private space tourism, but I thought his reaction was really, really moving, and I just wanted to share that with you today.
We can't hear them.
Of course. Who didn't check the box that said share sound? Never mind. you have an idea. If you haven't seen this, I would recommend that you watch it. It's brilliant. It's an amazing emotional response. But the thing, interestingly, that he said right at the end was, what I'd love to do is communicate as much as possible. And that's certainly something that, you know, I and the team will be doing for IP Group, making sure that investors, co-investors, entrepreneurs, business and government and policymakers are all aware of the scale of the opportunity that's facing IP Group, and it giving us a great chance to realize on it. And I very much welcome all of your support in helping us to do so. So I'll finish there and say, oh, I'll skip past him. Thank you for all your time. Thank you very much for all of your support that you've given to IP Group over the first 20 years. And of course, thank you in advance for your support over the next 20 years and beyond. Now, on the subject of government, I'm delighted to now introduce Kwasi Kwarteng, who you will all be aware is the Secretary of State for the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and he's going to say a few words. Kwasi, he holds a first in classics and history from Cambridge. He's been to Harvard. He's earned a PhD in economic history, but maybe most importantly, he's won university challenge, no less. So we may have to tap him up for a spin out of some description in the future. Adam, over to you.
Hello, I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but it's a real pleasure to send this message to mark the 20th anniversary of IP Group. For 20 years, IP Group has helped to take great ideas and turn them into brilliant businesses. This approach is one I hope to see emulated across the UK as we build back better. To that end, we recently launched a first of its kind innovation strategy. That is our long-term plan for how we'll boost private sector investment and create the right conditions for all businesses to turn world-leading science into exciting new products and services. The strategy looks at innovation through 4 key pillars. Firstly, we want to help unleash businesses who want to innovate to make the UK the most attractive destination in the world for innovation talent. Second, we want to ensure our institutions serve the needs of businesses and places across the UK. Third, we would love and we aspire to stimulate innovation to tackle major challenges through missions and drive capability in key technologies. Fourth, emerging technologies like the one supported by the IP Group will play a huge part in both our economic recovery and future prosperity. And so the innovation strategy identifies 7 technology families to focus domestic and international attention on the potential of UK tech. Clearly, it's not enough simply to identify these technologies. We must create the right environment across all parts of the innovation system to firstly allow people's ideas to bloom and flourish, and secondly, to help see them through to commercialization. Intellectual property is essential if we are to capitalize on technological advances. The UK's IP regime is one of the most highly regarded in the world, protecting around £63 billion of the 130 billion invested in knowledge assets by UK businesses every year. Now we've left the European Union, we can make our IP regime even stronger, and we're keen to ensure your voices are heard as we attempt to do so. In the innovation strategy, we made several commitments that will help ensure the UK's IP environment continues to lead the world. For example, we have established the International IP Service, which will lower the barriers for businesses navigating the international IP environment. And we will launch a consultation on the protection of inventions and creations made by AI to enable the UK's IP system to keep pace with technological change. In addition to our strategic commitments, the government recognises that the interoperability of standards and patents is becoming increasingly important for innovation. And so the IPO will lead a call for views on standard essential patents by the end of this year. I look forward to working with you as we continue to improve our IP regime. Thank you all very much.
Hopefully now Sam will be presenting life science vision for the future. Remember, if you have any questions to this, ask while we're going, and we can ask them Sam at the end.
So afternoon, everybody. I'm Sam Williams, Head of Life Sciences at IP Group. So I'm going to start with a story which goes back to 2005 and involves my first interaction with IP Group. I was then working as an equity analyst in the city and had been asked to look at a company called IP to IPO, as it was known then, potentially with a view to initiating coverage of its stock. And as part of this, I was invited to meet Dave Norwood, who was the company's founder and at that point still its CEO. Now I have to say, from the little that I knew about the company, I had a rather mixed impression of IP to IPO. On the one hand, it was investing in some very unusual companies out of Oxford that most people in conventional venture capital would probably not have even looked at. And I found that quite intriguing. On the other hand, it seemed to be doing this at a rather alarming rate. But I had an open mind, and so I accepted an invitation from Dave to meet him at his private members club in the West End. And this was the room in which we met. Anyway, Dave was very charming. And after some preamble, we got down to brass tacks, and I asked him why he felt his approach to investment would be able to compete with the conventional VCs. And in response, he proceeded to take a microtiter plate out of his inside jacket pocket. That is an array of miniature test tubes or wells in a plastic plate. It's a standard piece of laboratory equipment. As you can imagine, I was a little surprised. And he said quite authoritatively, "This is why we're going to be able to compete with the VCs. This comes from one of our companies. And in each of these wells is a miniature human heart." Now, I knew that it was not at the time possible to recreate a whole human heart in a test tube. And I assumed that Dave was just a little confused. And I said, "Well, I presume you mean that in each well is a collection of human heart cells," which I did know it was possible to culture at the time. But Dave was insistent. "No, there's a miniature human heart in there." "But no one has ever done that," I said. "That would be worthy of a Nobel Prize because it's currently impossible to do." Now, for those who know Dave, you'll know that he's never one to let a few minor facts get in the way of a good story. "Exactly," he said. "That's why we're better than the VCs. We can do things other people can't do. There may not be an actual human heart in there at the moment, if you say so, but there will be soon." And then he pulled a second microtiter plate out of his jacket pocket and he said, "In this one, there are whole kidneys." And so this went on. Now, I learned quite quickly there's little point in trying to correct Dave. His enthusiasm and imagination are boundless. But I did come away with a distinct impression that he thought like no other investor I'd met in the UK. He thought big and he thought imaginatively, but most importantly, he thought about the future. He might not have had a heart in his inside pocket, but he wanted to believe it was possible or would be possible. Cynical doubters like me were just an obstacle to realizing his vision. And so when considering what I'd say today, I thought it worth reflecting on what has been achieved on the life science side of IP Group in the 16 years since that meeting, and arguably as a consequence, directly or indirectly, of the unusual approach to investing that Dave instilled in the company, but also how those achievements are going to play a role in the future of healthcare over the next 20 years. Unfortunately, he never got his miniature heart, but there are many other miraculous inventions that have come out of IP Group and are helping improve people's health today and or will do so in the coming years. Of course, Greg has mentioned ONT and its revolutionary approach to DNA sequencing. That's allowed for the first sequencing to be conducted in space, which is fun, but a more meaningful impact is the one it's having in human healthcare, in allowing for more rapid, portable diagnosis of disease. And we've seen that in the use of ONT's technology in the fight against COVID. The role of ONT in diagnosis of disease is only going to increase. Staying on the genetic side of things, we have a company, Genomics PLC, which has developed highly sensitive means of identifying an individual's risk of developing cardiovascular disease, cancer, and autoimmunity with significantly greater sensitivity than current standard of care. Moving to disease management and treatment, we have a company, Hinge Health, that has developed wearable digital devices that can be used to monitor patient mobility and deliver impulse therapy to help in the fight against musculoskeletal pain, and which have changed the lives of thousands of people suffering from this condition. In mental health, one of our companies, IESO, has developed an online tool for cognitive behavioral therapy, which has shown greater resolution rates in patients suffering from anxiety and depression than existing standard of care. So there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people walking around today who are of a more stable status of mental health than they otherwise would have been without this technology. Moving to drugs, we have a company, Istesso, that's developed molecules that allow for the repair of damaged tissue in autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis, and now has a growing database of patients who've been successfully treated with these molecules. And in Diurnal, we have a company that has launched the first ever regulated prescription drugs for the treatment of a rare and life-threatening disease of the endocrine system in children, drugs that are right now having a positive impact on these children's lives. Probably the most striking example of impact on life relates to a company called Cure Therapeutics, which has developed a novel cell therapy for the treatment of a rare juvenile cancer called neuroblastoma. This is a very aggressive cancer that has proven resistant to almost every other therapy, such that the prognosis for these children is very bleak. Well, Cure's product was used to treat 2 children with neuroblastoma, both of whom responded to therapy, and one of whom had a complete eradication of their disease. So when I cast my mind back to that first meeting with Dave, I consider that however realistic you might have judged his ambition to have been then, the fact is that none of this might have happened were it not for him. And that child with neuroblastoma might have had a very different outcome. But what about the future? How do we see the future and the role that our companies will play in it? Well, we think of the future of healthcare will lie along 2 broad principles, that of eliminating disease and enhancing life. And the most obvious way to eliminate disease is through improved prevention. I've mentioned genomics PLC and its role in identifying people at risk of disease. We think that in 10 or even just 5 years' time, health authorities around the world will be routinely using technologies like genomic PLCs in day-to-day healthcare management to move people at risk onto preventative therapy. Cancer provides a really good example of the benefits of early detection. The earlier you can detect mutations in a person's DNA, the more quickly you can take preventative action against the tumor developing. And the stage at which we can detect such mutations through highly sensitive assays is getting earlier and earlier. In fact, our own company, Innovata, which we sold this year, is able to detect breast cancer 18 months earlier than existing methods. And we're currently looking at several investment opportunities which have the potential to create even more sensitive detection methods. Similarly, in mental health, we see a time when the algorithms being developed by our company, IESO, will be used to detect the early signs of mental instability through monitoring the way people interact with their phones and other electric devices. This may seem far-fetched, but the company has published incredible data that shows that very simple verbal cues can be used not only to detect the warning signs of anxiety or depression, but to actually retune a person's mood so that they are steered away from a depressed or anxious state. And this brings us to curing disease. Greg mentioned that only 3% of current R&D spend in healthcare is on curing rather than merely treating disease. Is this going to change? Are we going to be able to cure all diseases in the next 20 years? Well, we'll certainly be curing more diseases than we are today. And I think we'll be amazed at the number of inventions that come out in the next few years that right now no one has heard of and possibly don't even exist, but will provide a completely different approach to medicine. In this respect, it's worth noting what cell therapy is doing in cancer. When I met Dave 16 years ago, no one had heard of a technology called CAR-T. In fact, it didn't exist. Well, there are now 5 approved CAR-T therapies being used routinely to cure lymphoma, leukemia, and myeloma. And that forms the basis of the Cure Therapeutics technology, which was used to save the life of the child with neuroblastoma. I think it's quite possible that many more common cancers will be curable within 20 years as we develop cell and gene therapies with an even greater understanding of the genetic basis of those cancers and could create increasingly bespoke therapies for every individual patient. And ONT's technology will play a key role in that. So coming on to the second of these 2 principles, that of enhancing life, whether in those who have overcome disease or possibly have never had disease in the first place. Some have talked about humans becoming part bionic with digital implants and artificial organs grown in the test tube, much like Dave's heart, and used to replace the aging parts of our bodies and help us live fuller and longer lives. Of course, we already do this with knee and hip replacements, but will we ever be able to grow a fully functioning heart in the lab? Possibly not. However, another approach to this might be achieved with pharmacological reprogramming. That is, drugs that have been very carefully designed to tweak the activity of biochemical pathways and hence reduce harmful processes in the body which build up in old age. For example, Istesso's drug for rheumatoid arthritis has been shown to reprogram the immune system to allow for regeneration of damaged tissue. So the obvious question is, why shouldn't you use that drug to address the usual wear and tear of old age, arthritis in the hands and knees, atherosclerosis of the blood vessels, and degeneration of neurons? Well, we've actually developed a second drug within Istesso for exactly this purpose. That is a drug that can actively reprogram cells so that they take up a more healthy phenotype or living form. And this is an image taken from a recent experiment that shows how we're able, with this particular drug, targeting the mitochondria of neurons to enhance neuronal activity, increase connectivity, and stimulate neuronal branching. And as you can imagine, this could have applicability not only in treating neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, but also enhancing mental capacity in normal, healthy, aging individuals. So in 20 years, there will be people on a call like this who will have been routinely treated once or twice or more for diseases detected so early in their development that they were never allowed to become symptomatic. People who will be on dietary, behavioral, and drug regimens dictated by their genetic profile, thus having saved them from heart attack, stroke, autoimmunity, cancer, and other catastrophic events, who will be interacting with their phones and devices in a way that allows them to overcome mental health issues before they even take hold, and who are living longer and healthier and more functional lives. So in fact, it may well be me giving this talk in 20 years if I can hang on, but let's see. So Dave, I'm going to hand over to you because I think you may have some questions there.
Yeah, Sam, thank you very much. Let's have a look. I've actually only got one through at the moment. The question is, given the news today about DNA sequencing being used to diagnose disease, do you think that ONT's technology will play a role here?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So this was a study by Genomics England and I think Queen Mary, which used whole genome sequencing to identify patients with as yet undiagnosed rare disease, and which led to successful treatment in a number of cases. And it's exactly the sort of thing I've been talking about and will become more and more common. And of course, will come earlier in life, such that some of these people who had developed symptoms will not even get to the symptomatic stage before they have treatment. If I'm not mistaken, I don't think ONT's technology was used in the specific study, but it almost certainly will be used in future studies like this and in this sort of clinical practice as it becomes more common.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. That's the only one that's come through so far. So thank you very much indeed.
Great, thanks.
We'll hand on to Mark.
Thanks, David. I'm Mark Riley. I run the technology partnership at IP Group, which means I'm expected to be adroit in getting my slides up rapidly when I do these sort of things. Here we go. I think you can see the slides. And so on IP Group's 20th birthday, I've been reflecting on my own career with the group. I've been at IP Group for about 10 years now. And during that time, it's sort of surprising to look back on it now that what we were doing in the early stages of my career with IP Group was sort of unfashionable, as the other speakers have described, and our style of investment was not something that had a lot of attention at the time. And it's surprising to look back on that now with the capital flows and the hype that's going into early stage technology investment now. And I was talking about this to Robert, who is speaking after me today, Robert Trezona in our clean tech team. And he told me that he was at COP last week, the climate change conference in Scotland. And he met a very experienced investor there who was amazed that IP Group's been investing in clean tech since 2004. And that is amazing in itself to think that now with all this attention on clean tech, that there was this kind of cold winter during which clean tech was considered a sort of failed fashion adventure where many had lost money, and we continue to believe in the need for clean technology and innovation that would help us achieve net zero. And the same thing is somewhat true on the deep tech side as well. We've been doing deep tech at IP Group since before the term deep tech existed, and we've been one of the very few investors backing innovative cutting-edge technologies straight out of research labs over the last 50 years. So it's therefore no surprise that we've been behind the most successful deep tech venture exits over the last few years in the UK's and indeed in Europe's venture investment first of all, Ceres Power, which has already been mentioned several times, this incredible company that makes fuel cell components, fuel cell devices. The technology was originally invented at Imperial College in London, and IP Groups invested in that company, and it was there in the early stages of the commercialization journey. That was what we believe to be the biggest ever venture-backed clean tech exit that Europe has ever seen, our success from Ceres Power. And similarly, we backed on the deep tech side, we backed a company called Wave Optics, which makes these little projector devices and waveguides that go into augmented reality spectacles. And we sold that company earlier this year in May to a company called Snap Inc., a US listed entity, who paid, well, it was quoted in the press as more than $500 million for Wave Optics, which again we believe was the biggest ever deep tech exit in European history. There's one other contender that may come close. We think it's either first or second biggest ever exit. So these exits, they show that our success goes beyond Oxford Nanopore. As Nanopore showed, it takes some time to develop these assets to their full potential and to realize value from them. But those two exits that I've just mentioned, Ceres and Wave Optics, were less than 10 years between our first investment and realizing cash value from them. And in fact, our success goes beyond Nanopore, it goes beyond Ceres, and it goes beyond Wave Optics. We've had quite a few exits over the last few years in the deep tech portfolio, all profitable exits that have, in total, we've realized almost £200 million just in the last 3 years out of the deep tech portfolio alone. So it's been an incredibly successful period that leaves us very well positioned for the next stage. So what's next? What's next for the technology partnership and IP Group? Well, as Greg says, we're just in the foothills of the opportunity. What's next for us is an increasing focus on specific technology megatrends that we've identified, and will continue to build increasingly specialized skill sets in the investment teams around those megatrend areas. And the first of those, perhaps the most obvious of those, is we are doubling down on our strength in clean tech. The world appears to have caught up with us finally in believing that clean tech is the most important area for innovation for our generation and generations to follow. And we need to invest in technologies that will enable the transition to net zero. We at IP Group, as a result of having invested in this field for so long, we have a rare depth of expertise in that area. And we have a team that exhibits that expertise, but also a team that is driven by a kind of deep passion for this field and a deep desire to look their grandchildren in the eye and tell them that they did everything possible to make their world an inhabitable place. So we're going to put those attributes to work. We're committing a large amount of capital to growing and expanding our clean tech portfolio. And you'll increasingly see our clean tech function take on even greater energy and momentum. And to give you an initial idea of how we're thinking about the climate opportunity, there's a body in the UK called the Energy Transitions Commission. And Robert, who's speaking after me in the clean tech team, is a member of that Energy Transitions Commission. He's a commissioner. And that commission, the independent body, recently published this graph of all the different industries where we will need to consider methods of decarbonisation in order to achieve net zero. And there's lots of different industries where there's a major problem with emissions, and different solutions will be required to overcome the problems that we have with emissions and to reduce the carbon emissions from those sectors. And IP Group, our existing clean tech portfolio, is exposed to all the different areas, all across this graph of different industries that need to be decarbonised. We have, for example, Bramble Energy, which has a novel approach that uses printed circuit board technology. So this was developed at Imperial College and at University College London, and they're able to use the materials and processes that are used in creating printed circuit boards to create fuel cells. And that means that they can produce very high performance, low cost fuel cell stacks that have the potential to transform applications like vehicular applications of fuel cells, perhaps even aviation, very cheaply, because they can use existing methods and existing materials from the printed circuit board process. We also have sea capture in the portfolio, which has a world-leading chemical process for the capture of carbon dioxide. We have Hysata in the portfolio, an Australian company that has a novel electrolyzer with the potential to shift the economics of green hydrogen production. There's a company in the portfolio called Mixergy, which is making novel hot water tank technology that's designed to optimize energy consumption in buildings. So you can see right across all these different industries, we have tailored solutions that we're already exposed to. But on top of the existing portfolio, we're also very focused now on deploying capital into new opportunities in clean tech. And we have a pipeline of really exciting new opportunities. And just to give you one example, you may have seen last week, there was some press coverage of a new investment that we've done. We have invested in a company that is developing a new lightweight and compact ammonia reactor, an as yet unnamed company, but it's developing this lightweight ammonia reactor that could enable it, particularly there's an application in shipping where there is a big problem with the emissions of all the shipping that goes on around the world, and it could allow ammonia to be used as a fuel for shipping and possibly even aviation, which may in the long term enable guilt-free flying again, which will be a fantastic outcome. So you can see that it's our desire to create impact with all the investments we make, and this is a very fertile area for us to do that in at the moment, of course. So that's the clean tech side. And moving on to deep tech. So in deep tech, we're focused on digital disruption. We're focused on the pervasive diffusion of digital technologies. It's a huge mega trend that's changing every aspect of our lives, of our civilization, and IP Group wants to invest in technologies that will have a positive impact on that digital change. And we're doing that in several different sort of sectors of deep tech. The first of which is ubiquitous communications. So the world now has these 50 billion connected devices, and the increasing pressure that's put on communication networks by the expansion of supply and demand of data is not, our existing communications infrastructure is not able to cope with those demands. And so we're investing companies at different levels of the communication infrastructure stack that will enable the new use cases that are brought about by artificial intelligence use cases, brought about by augmented and virtual reality. And we're all placing pressures on our communications infrastructure. Another area that we remain very interested in is the evolving human-machine interface, the changing way in which we're interacting with computers, which of course is moving towards methods of interaction that are more akin to the way that we interact with other human beings. And that's why we were in Wave Optics, the company that I mentioned earlier, that we exited earlier this year. And of course, we're a major shareholder in Ultraleap, which has this world-leading hand tracking and haptic feedback technology that's now to be found in some of the leading virtual reality headsets that you can buy as a consumer. And we're seeing incredibly strong feedback about the power of the Ultraleap technology in those devices. Another totally different area where we've built up expertise and a valuable portfolio now is the area of fintech and cybersecurity. As Greg said, this is a huge global financial opportunity. I read a quote the other day from the head of the National Security Agency in the US, who said that cybersecurity or cybercrime represents the greatest transfer of wealth in history. There are gargantuan numbers associated with this market now. We have a couple of rapidly growing assets in this area. First of all, Garrison Cybersecurity that announced recently 150% growth and revenues over $10 million now. So that company's growing very rapidly. And of course, we have Featurespace, the largest company in the deep tech portfolio, which is going from strength to strength, and its product is now an important tool for many major financial institutions. And the final sector in deep tech that we are focused on, and perhaps the most ambitious of all, is the field of neuromorphic and quantum computing. Neuromorphic computers being an approach to computing that replicates the way that our brain processes and computes information. And we've made a small number of carefully selected investments in this area. What excites me about this is it's a very ambitious long-term play, but what excites me is that quantum computers have the potential to model quantum systems, and we live in a quantum system, and so it can really underpin profound breakthroughs in the capabilities of our society and our understanding of the universe. And that really speaks to IP Group's key objective. We would like to make profitable investments, but profitable investments that have a positive impact on our society and on the way that we live our lives. And I think all of the focus areas that I've talked about, we have the potential to do that with innovative technologies. So with that, I will hand over to Robert Trezona, who's come to talk to us about the work that IP Group's, a bit more detail of the work that IP Group's doing in clean tech.
Great, thanks, Mark. So I'm going to talk a bit about clean tech, but also in the context of the COP26 climate conference, which is still going on in Glasgow. Some of the reflections on these couple of weeks, which I think are going to be crucial for us as a company, but also for geopolitics and economic development in the 21st century. So this is an image of the announcement board at Euston Station on the way up to COP last week. And it's been an extraordinary time for us, and we spent a decent amount of time interacting with lots of exciting stakeholders in that environment. As Mark mentioned earlier, we're members of an organization called the Energy Transitions Commission. And as you said, it's not a sort of sign-up organization. It's something where you have to be invited to be a member. We were delighted to be asked to join as the only venture capital organization in the ETC. And the gentleman on the left there is Lord Adair Turner, who has had a long and distinguished career in public life and is now chairing the commission. And the reason I mentioned the commission in the context of sort of climate change and COP26 is the sort of mission of that organization is to be, fundamentally catalytic in getting us to net zero and managing climate change. And it's had an extraordinary influence on developments in Glasgow. The way it works is all those different organizations, we see logos there, so oil and gas companies, renewables companies like Ørsted, large financial institutions, BlackRock, HSBC, we all jointly fund the organization and set its agenda. And the intention is to produce really impactful research on how you get to net zero in detail by industry. And that creates a set of roadmaps for how we can do this. And guided by Adair, who is well known as an economist, how we can do it in an affordable and just manner. And we were really invited to provide sort of technology input to that group. And as Sam and Mark have talked about, we make investments and have done for a long time in these quite fundamental technologies. And a lot of other people working in VC in the space are doing things in business model innovation and software. We have been doing since 2004, as Greg mentioned, kind of fundamental technologies like hydrogen, like carbon capture. And that's the thing that people in this group and indeed the sort of audience of the ETC are interested in. So this is a chart that features in a lot of ETC publications. It's a set of scenarios for how you could reduce carbon dioxide emissions. So that's gigatons of CO2 is the sort of vertical axis over time, and keep us within this safe limit of 1.5 degrees C. So you'll have heard lots of talk this week around 1.5 versus things like 2 and 2.3. And it's a classic example of scientists choosing the absolute right metric, but maybe not the optimal communication method. These don't sound like very scary changes to the climate. The way I like to articulate what does safe look like and why is 2.3 degrees maybe a bad thing. 1.5 degrees is a temperature change where we will have survivable summers. We're not going to have heat waves where it's impossible for humans to survive outdoors. And if we get much above 2 degrees, that starts to happen. So that we're really talking about a fundamental crisis, but we're lucky to have institutions like the IPCC who have just mapped out those are the emissions trajectories that will deliver sort of a safe limit. And this is where the concept of net zero comes from. Because look at the center there, around about 2050, we need to be plus minus zero emissions, down from about 40 gigatons today. And there's been a lot of focus, sorry, this is a complicated chart, but just a few simple messages from it. A lot of focus this week around action this decade in the 2020s. And if you look at that previous chart, you have to have quite substantial reductions in almost all the scenarios from the IPCC during this decade in order to hit 1.5 degrees. So that we're talking about order 20 gigatons to sort of stay on track. And as we put it in a recent ETC publication, to keep 1.5 degrees alive. The submissions from the various countries participating in the UN process the NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, don't get anywhere near that 1.5 degrees. So if you look here on the chart, this is where the NDCs get us to. And this is why people like the Climate Action Tracker are so concerned. So one of the things that we did in the run-up to COP was publish a document around achievable, cost-effective things you could do in the next 10 years that would get us close to this target of 20 gigaton reduction. So this is, given all the ex-McKinsey people involved, the classic kind of waterfall chart of how you might do that. I won't spend too much time on it, but these have all been costed. And I think one of the sort of exciting things about this work is the ETC team have been very close to the presidency. So Alok Sharma, former UK government minister, is president of COP as hosts here in the UK. And we've been talking extensively to him and his team around initiatives that could keep us on track. And I'll just briefly go through a few of them. This blue bar, this sort of yellow bar here is nature-based solutions, which, to put it simply, is about ending deforestation. This is around power, which is around coal. Road is around electric vehicles, and supply side decarbonisation and energy resource efficiency around broader electrification. And these are all things that we thought would be achievable, not just here in the West, but also in emerging economies. And I think one of the exciting things has been, as we've gone through a week and a half so far of COP26, we're seeing some of these messages and some of these ideas actually happening. So we've had a number of multilateral agreements during the week. So these are not full UN agreements where every member is signing up to it via the Article 6 process. These are agreements where governments have entered into, lots of multilateral agreements, over 100 governments outside the UN process, but still meaningful binding commitments. So we had quite early on an agreement around ending deforestation, an agreement around clean transport, which was yesterday, and several coal agreements, including countries like South Africa and Indonesia and Vietnam, where the real emphasis has been, how do we help those countries get access to really cost-effective renewable energy to help them transition off coal? So that's been highly sort of encouraging, and we played a small part in making that happen by supporting the ETC, who've been part of those negotiations. In terms of clean tech and technology specifically, there was a US brokered agreement called the Glasgow Breakthroughs Initiative, which is all about really turbocharging the rate at which cost of all these clean technologies that we've been investing in can come down. So that was a really exciting initiative, and it's all about getting volume into those new technologies, working together as multiple countries to make the markets really accessible and as large as possible. And we're seeing some sort of ready interest from our portfolio companies in that initiative specifically. And that one was great, where we had US and China and India and the EU were all signatories to it. Total opportunity there from all those technologies being deployed over the next decade is $16 trillion as calculated by the US Department of Energy. So really exciting, another COP agreement there. And then there have been a number of industry initiatives, so specific industries, as Mark was referring to earlier. All of these are in the multi-billion dollar level. So on hydrogen, we've had sort of FFI and Bamford, the sort of JCB family, announce a big initiative. SNAM is an Italian gas organization. They've got a hydrogen catapult. Long duration energy storage, the big consortium of players was announced yesterday, and we're involved in that one. Green steel, and we met the people who are behind the concept of making steel in a zero carbon way from hydrogen. And finally announced yesterday a number of shipping and aviation agreements that were part of a broader ETC plan called the Mission Possible Partnership. So, as I was sort of going around meetings in Glasgow, there's a huge amount of stuff happening in the blue and the green zone with the official UN process. But these are all sort of side agreements happening, in sort of meetings where you've just got a group of players from government, but also from industry and from finance coming together to try and make this happen. And then yesterday, just literally as I was preparing these slides, I saw this announcement, which is a US-China agreement, which is something we'd hoped for, weren't sure that we were going to get. And the deal was announced yesterday. It's fairly sketchy in terms of details, but both countries have come out and said this is real. as we understand it, President Biden and President Xi will be speaking on Monday. And both countries have many disagreements at the moment, but they are both massively at risk on climate change, and realize that working together is hugely to their benefit. So that was super exciting, and it could be critical in making COP26 a success. In addition to the NDCs and the COP process, we've seen countries announce net zero commitments, and as investors, we actually think these are potentially more important than those nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. And the net zero commitments, as you can see from this, are spreading kind of across the globe. They cover almost all the big emitters, Russia being one big exception. But this has been transformational, and it's really helped drive interest from finance. And as illustrated by this chart, so this is sort of climate-related funds going into clean tech. These are cross asset classes, so it's got infrastructure and fixed income as well as equities. And there we have Larry Fink, chairman of BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, talking about the transition as this historic investment opportunity. Then moving specifically into what we do, into sort of innovation and venture capital, as you can see here, it's an even steeper chart. There's just been an explosion of interest in this space. We look back in here, when we started, before this chart was even a thing, in 2004, really excitingly, in these years, 11, 12, 13, 14, we were really making a lot of investments, including in Ceres Power, and we're now benefiting from that. So a lot of this money coming in now is for follow-on capital and co-investment in our portfolio, and it's just become a huge area of broader venture investment that we can benefit from directly. And then just looking at the future, as I think Mark said earlier, we kind of live in the future as venture investors. This is a so-called Sankey diagram showing how the energy transition could actually look. How do you actually get to net zero in detail? How does the energy system need to change? So over here on the left, this is today total global energy use for the entire global economy is 580 exajoules. And most of that is still today provided by fossil fuels. This in the middle now is what 2050 looks like. So total energy requirements of just over 400 exajoules. So there's a massive decrease in energy requirements. The reason that happens despite economic growth is electrification. So one of the great news stories around clean tech is when you electrify something like a car, it doesn't just get cleaner, it gets a lot more efficient. It gets, say, 3 times as efficient. The same for building heating. So we can transition to zero carbon technologies and also reduce our energy requirements. And what you can see is this chart flips around. We go from mostly fossil, small amount of zero carbon power, to mostly zero carbon power from renewables and nuclear, small amount of fossil with CCS. On the right here, you can see the application. So we talked about a few of those already. Hydrogen is an essential part of the zero carbon economy. That's a big part. Ammonia for heavy duty transport, as per our announcement yesterday. And electrification of aviation, zero carbon fuels for long haul aviation, and 2 areas actually which we're going to start to focus on for investments in the next few years is around zero carbon construction materials, replacing the huge emissions from actually cement and concrete, and also heating and cooling in buildings, and particularly, as I mentioned, with those very high temperature summers that we're going to get, we need to dramatically improve efficiency of air conditioning. So we have a roadmap, and part of the work with the ETC we look at is this is an affordable thing. There's as Greg mentioned earlier, multi-trillion investment opportunity. It's still only a couple of % of GDP to basically keep civilization going, and it represents a very certain and reliable investment trend. We're going to have to invest in renewables, in grid, and nuclear and hydro and hydrogen. We have numbers to this. The numbers are in the hundreds of billions of dollars per year. So it's a huge, huge investment opportunity with a fair degree of certainty. So in summary, we're a science-driven and science-inspired organization. The science is clear. Climate change is an existential threat to human civilization. It's not just about slightly higher water, sea levels and extinction of animals. This really threatens our way of life. Critically, we know how to avoid it. We know how we can get emissions down. We know the cost of doing that. There are now comprehensive roadmaps that are affordable, which we understand in quite a lot of detail. And those roadmaps require transformation of our energy system. As I said earlier, and Mark also alluded to, this is a profound investment opportunity. And unlike certain other areas, it's reliable. We know that for at least the next 30 years, those investments need to happen, and we can really double down in the space. Technologies are critical to that. The rate of technology innovation has been amazing, and the stuff we're seeing from innovators just in the last 6 months has been really sort of humbling and deeply exciting. And we have the opportunity to do incredibly well in this space and have a huge impact. We've been doing it for a long time. We've been successful, and the opportunity really for us now is to become a recognized leader using the patient capital platform that we've inherited from the likes of Dave Norwood and Alan Aubrey to be an absolute leader in the space. So with that, I'll finish. I'll be just about on time. I think there is some time for some questions, which I think David Baines is going to moderate.
Well done, Rob. Great. Thanks. As you say, just about time was almost perfect. All of you were out by only 3 minutes. So perhaps those people who've been presenting would like to appear again. It's good to see you. We had a little flurry of questions coming in. If I can, I'll pull them up again. The first one will probably go over quite quickly because I think it's probably been pretty comprehensively answered. But Hannah, lovely to have you with us, Hannah. That's in Forum for the Future. I hope your colleague Jane Lawton is also here. We're delighted you've both joined us. So your original question was, with the various references to COP24 by speakers, what are some of the key risks and opportunities you see for IP Group companies in responding to the needs that changing climate will force on us? And we've heard an awful lot about the opportunities, I suspect, but Rob, just a touch on the risks, perhaps.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And basically, this refers probably to the TCFD framework, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And that's an initiative led by Mark Carney and others. And it's kind of profoundly changed the way the broader sort of financial service industry looks at the space, right? So we will have a requirement in this country by 2025 to disclose risks and opportunities around climate change as people in the investment game. So we've been thinking about this for quite some time. And we're also lucky as IP Group. So, it's in the name, our capital and value creation is in intangibles. So our companies build technologies that can be licensed and exported. They're not real assets companies. So we're quite lucky not to be very heavily exposed. We as IP Group have a very small footprint and small exposure to risks. At first analysis, the portfolio looks relatively robust towards climate, but we're actually doing a comprehensive piece of work on the top 30 assets to really sort of make sure we've understood all those risks. We'll publish that in the next few months.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks. I appreciate that. Well, I'll go to the next one. Odysseus, lovely to have you with us today. Thank you very much for joining. Slightly long question. You've got a question for both Mark and Sam. Given we've lost Sam, this is one for you, Mark, I think. It says, you've recently realised a lot of cash, which we have. And from what it seems, there's a lot of opportunity to recycle this. Understand it's a timely process to find the right companies to deploy this into, but you have to have an idea, I guess, of your convictions, which niches you actually, you want to invest that money in. So the specific question is, if you had to deploy 200 million of your cash tomorrow, let's say 100 million of that into deep tech and clean tech and 100 in life sciences, so we'll do deep tech and clean tech, how would you allocate it between the particular niches that you've mentioned? Maybe Rob might review as well, I'm sure, but we'll start with you, Mark.
Well, Sam's not here, so we can cut that allocation to life science for a start and put it all into technology. So I don't have the luxury of answering this question in the hypothetical because, of course, we have budgets and we make these decisions every day at IP Group. My answer in technology is we're, as I said in the talk, putting a lot of emphasis into clean tech at the moment. A lot of our budget is allocated and intended to go into clean tech companies. And Rob can talk about the sub-allocation of that, but and then on the deep tech side, we're focused on getting the maximum value out of these really high potential companies in clean tech and cybersecurity. So the sort of the remainder that hasn't gone into clean tech is probably split half and half between cybersecurity and the sort of the wider communications ICT focus that we've got. And then there's nothing left after that, but a small amount in quantum computing is the trailing amount.
It's amazing how quickly you can spend 100 million, isn't it? Rob, did you want to add anything to that? Or?
Well, it's interesting that number. So 200. I actually have a plan that will invest 200 if I can get 200 million. So I mean, where would you put it? I mean, we're seeing more and more companies where the customer interest. So people like Snam, I mentioned earlier. Huge renewables companies, people like Ørsted, Vestas. They are coming to us and saying, we're interested in your hydrogen technology, in people like Bramble, in people like Sea Capture, and we want to get deployed as quickly as possible. And so that really pushes the sort of ability to deploy capital up, because you've got real customer interest, and a lot of the sort of uses of funds would be first of a kind project. Can you scale it faster? Can we do multiple locations simultaneously? So the conversation's just fundamentally changed as the boards of those large corporates have all agreed for things like TCFD, they've got to transition as fast as possible. There's a huge opportunity around climate, and funnily enough, 200 million is a plan that we actually have. So I won't go into the details now, but it would certainly involve a lot around hydrogen, around things like carbon capture and ammonia, as discussed earlier, which we think is a huge theme.
Thanks, Rob. The next one, Odysseus, you've got a follow-up question. I think I'll point this one towards you, Greg. It's actually one of our old favourites. I think we spend a lot of time talking about. So following up from this, how confident are you that your sourcing network gives you an advantage over other funds in deploying this capital? And could you give some examples of recent funding rounds that you've taken part in? The others might chip in on that. But perhaps a question on sourcing, first of all, which is a question we talk about a lot.
Yeah, we do talk about it a lot. I mean, it's interesting, the reflections on the last 15, 20 years. People have never really, concerned or been worried about sourcing, because quite often we've been the only people there taking a view on science and thinking about how you might form a company around science. And of course, that is an important part of what we do. I mean, to be honest, though, the balance of activity, of course, is in, once you found those businesses, growing them, finding the teams, getting the capital, getting the commercials, etc., going. But in terms of sourcing network, I mean, people will be aware it varies from territory to territory. Maybe a good example would be a company that Rob can talk about, and that's a company that came out of some research from a university in Australia, and the University of Wollongong, so not a partner university in Australia, and it's a novel way of creating very low cost green hydrogen, order of magnitude cheaper, and this, to me, demonstrated a few things. Obviously, having the sourcing capability in Australia was very useful. Having the expertise, deep sector expertise in clean tech was very useful. And having connectivity between those two businesses and an ability to do due diligence, and for Rob to lean on the ETC and their vast experience. So that was a relatively unique thing to be able to bring to the party and really create value. And in that case, there are rare companies where we think, the commercial pool that Rob was talking about is so vast that actually these early things we may well get behind and accelerate them sooner than we have done in the past, given that sort of customer pool that Rob was talking about. So that's quite a good example. Not a partner network, which is the way we source a lot of our deals in Australia. But a combination of local presence with expertise. I can think of loads. I mean, maybe Rob or Mark would like to.
It's just worth sort of on that deal, which is incredibly exciting, and it got a lot of interest from people in Glasgow. I mean, I think we're lucky to have people in the team who've worked as scientists and engineers for a decent amount of time before coming to IP Group. And so in winning that deal was about, through actually Paul Barrett, who is himself a hydrogen engineer. He's got a network, I've got a network. We kind of know the people around the world who've been doing impactful stuff over the last 20 years. And it wasn't really because we went to the University of Wollongong TT, it was because we knew the inventor, who's someone who's done 6 other businesses and multiple exits. And he came to us saying, look, I know you guys are in the space, companies like Ceres Power, and I'm going to take my extraordinary idea. I mean, really is an amazing idea. It's sort of hairs in the back of your neck, profound bit of innovation to you. And then we were able to bring, our network of people like places like UCL. We've got some of them involved. Some of the top people in Europe are in that company. And it just comes from having people who fundamentally get technology, have worked in it, have been in labs, have run experiments, and have a network of others. I think that's what I would describe as the advantage. Is sometimes it's relationships with the universities, but more generally, it's about we exist in networks of people doing amazing things as scientists, and then we can use that to find these deals.
I'm going good. The questions are coming in thick and fast. So if you don't mind, I'll move on to the next one, because we said we're going to try and answer everyone's questions. So Hannah is back. I'm going to give this one to you first, Greg. I think it's quite tricky, but see how we get with this one. So as my previous questions now have been amply answered by the two speakers, thank you very much. Here's another one. How is IP Group mapping the future risks and opportunities that these mega trends present? And how is it using the power of collaboration to ensure joint action on the risk and opportunity areas?
Yeah, well, that's a super question, isn't it? So again, we can do it by example. I think maybe Hannah was asking that just before Rob very ably described how we're taking this approach and thinking about where do we invest capital from, given our timeframes, given our expertise in climate tech and in clean tech. So maybe I'll just step back a little bit from that and say, a reflection for me, one of the really great things about taking over as CEO of the business now is that after significant recent success, we've just got a little opportunity to pause for breath here, not for a great long period of time. You've got to keep moving. We've got lots to do. There's huge amounts of impact, but to really think about where is it that there is this sort of intersection of huge societal need, huge commercial opportunity, and at where we can best use some of those organizational strengths I was talking about before. So that the sort of the intersection of those three things. And I think we benefit from this sort of incredible network internally in the portfolio companies and externally with various partners. And so I think there is a huge opportunity for us to really sort of supercharge that type of activity. And one of the things I'm focused on in the next sort of 3 to 6 months as we think about how big is the opportunity for IP Group is to really explore those intersections of those three areas. There's loads of examples of sort of intersections of technology areas, of commercial areas, and of geographies. I've spoken about the hydrogen investment. So I think that's stepping back a bit, like where will we really play to our strengths and where will we really create really significant value and impact. Rob's obviously given the example, incredibly articulately on this sort of balance of risk and opportunity. We do meet as a board and we talk about these things, and we meet as an execo and we talk about these things. I think a great question. And fantastic opportunity for us to really take IP Group to the next level.
I'll move on. Hannah's got another one coming. So moving on to the next one. This one actually, I hope you don't mind. I'm not going to try and answer this actually, because I think it's really specifically for Sam. I just didn't want you to feel I'd left you out. The specific questions around, for all the innovation and therapeutic development you're spearheading, do you also look to innovative approaches in clinical trials, endpoints, in relation to regulators? If you don't mind, I'm not going to bounce out on any of the team. I think that one I'll get Sam to answer you directly, if that's okay. Dave,
with sort of great CEO alacrity, I asked Lisa what she thought on that question, and Lisa, thinking on the power of technology, she said, yes, we absolutely do. Our companies are regularly in open dialogue with the regulators and always explore the most rapid way that you can get through those clinical pathways, expedite development with the patient in mind. And she gave the example of diurnal. You remember Sam showed that really sort of powerful picture of the child. And what I find really sort of inspiring about diurnal is the fact that their first treatment was the first of a kind treatment for children with these rare endocrine disease and disorders. And right from the start, the team were interfacing with the EMA and the MHRA to work out the trial design for something that hadn't been done before. So yes, and I think that's part of the sort of magic sauce in the years of experience that we've got in taking these companies. So thank you, Lisa. Well done for getting us out of a tight spot there.
Yeah, well done, good. Actually, ironically, perhaps I could answer that one in hindsight.
Yeah, well, quite, yeah.
Well done, putting your head on that one. Next, Charles Weston. Lovely to have you here, Charles. Good to hear from you. Charles, you're asking AI, ML, and big data are very hot topics themselves a few years ago, but now seem to be a means to an end to address specific challenges. Do you have any overarching AI, ML strategy that can be deployed? Or how do you leverage these technologies between portfolio companies? I think I'm looking at you, Mark, for that one. I should have said at the beginning, but I think that's you, isn't it?
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, nice to hear from you. Yeah, so I wholeheartedly agree with the premise that there's, people have been coming to us with AI companies since it became a sort of fashionable trend in venture. And of course, a lot of our companies have been using AI and machine learning long before it was the fashionable way to describe it. And they just describe themselves as software companies. And it struck me that a lot of the companies were describing themselves as being AI companies. It's a bit like saying, I'm an internet company in the early 2000s. It's sort of it's a platform, it's a means to deliver a value proposition, but it's not a product in itself. And the same is true of AI. So no, we don't have an overarching strategy in the sense of investing in AI as a concept. We have companies that are using AI to deliver specific value propositions, and we look at those within the industrial verticals that we're focused on.
Thank you. I'll move you on. Yeah, Hannah, you're back. This question's Greg, also Rob, I'll probably have a view. If I'm permitted a third question, I have a further one around not only mapping ahead future risks and opportunities, but also mapping ahead possible implications of R&D and product decisions. It goes on. The family of companies within IP Group can be an excellent source of solution to global challenges, as I think we've proven. However, much of the situation that we find ourselves in now regards the existential threat of climate change. Is because as a species, we've been very poor at mapping future implications of decisions that we're making as we go along. How do we best avoid negative implications of decisions to be made now in this well-publicized critical decade of action? Well, that's a big, wide question. Would you like to start that, Greg?
Well, it feels, I think where Hannah is pointing at that one is particularly on the climate side. I mean, Rob Look is the real expert along with his team. I mean, one of the observations I had at COP was the discussion around consumer-led behavior, what that meant for value propositions. And I was at a couple of events where you had CEOs of FMCG businesses who were saying, look, this is no longer a push from companies trying to put products. It's people who are interfacing very deliberately on everything from the nature of packaging to the content of product, and they're almost designing in these things. So I think that that consumer trend is quite an interesting one. There's quite a lot of pull now for behavioral trends that are supportive of things that you want to see a change in the future. And I think that feels relatively big and new to me on that front. I don't know, Rob, what would you add on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So this is kind of really around unintended consequences, and sort of, we weren't great at spotting climate change. Interesting thing about climate change is you go back to Tyndall in 1860 and then Svante Arrhenius in 1890. We had calculated the impact of burning the known fossil reserves in 1890. So Arrhenius calculated it then. He said it's going to be about 2 degrees plus or minus a degree. So, we've known about this for a very long time. I think what's been the challenge is the communication of that issue and the sort of other interests. And I think I have seen some really egregious examples of action more or less around climate change that had really unintended consequences and ended up damaging the climate. So a couple of high profile examples are the corn ethanol as a biofuel in the US, the UK government pushing diesel cars as a low carbon solution. And I think if you look at each of those examples, there was some other reason why governments went for those things. So in the case of the US, it was to keep farmers happy who are very politically powerful in the US, and they made a bunch of money on subsidies. And in the case of diesel and Dieselgate and Volkswagen, there's a hugely powerful, engine industry lobby that was heavily involved in presenting diesel as a not net zero, but better than petrol solution. I think what's exciting now is net zero is a kind of fairly, what's the word, precise thing, right? If your solution is still emitting quite a lot of carbon, it's not net zero. We need all the carbon sinks like trees for things like food production. So it gets a lot easier ever since net zero started to become a thing in 17, 18. And so my advice, and we get involved in policymaker decisions a bit via the ETC and also direct conversation with the UK government, is any of these kind of like, well, natural gas is probably a bit better than coal, let's do that. They don't work. They haven't worked historically, and they've always had negative consequences. We have an amazing suite of like truly kind of low impact technologies like silicon solar cells and batteries and things. And I think if we stick to that and use the science that we have, and people like Svante Arrhenius's great grandchildren who just were very clear around climate change a long time ago, that I think we can steer a course. And there is a great body of knowledge around the scientific community on how to get there and avoid those compromises that have caused us problems in the past.
Thank you, Rob. Great answer. So to the last question, we got to as an anonymous attendee, and actually one that again, Greg will have a view. I think I might have a view with my CFO hat on, and Douglas as well may well have a view. It seems very appropriate for our chairman to comment on as well. So that is the question: how do you get the share price to reflect the value that IP Group obviously has within the portfolio? Who would like to go first? Douglas, may I ask you to go first?
It's a great question. I think that what the team can do is continue to do what they're doing in terms of identifying, supporting, nurturing, investing in the portfolio companies. We need to think as a group whether there is more we can do to communicate the inherent value and the aspirational value that these investments represent. But at the end of the day, the share price will reflect the extent to which our shareholders and investors believe in the story. So the mega picture as well as the individual story and our skill in articulating it. But I guess I always say to someone who asks that question, if you believe the shares are undervalued, then you can help us by buying some more.
Greg, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously this has been a challenge for the business, the volatility. We've been pioneering, and a few others have done this now in our industry. We've been very pioneering in trying to access permanent capital with a model that is traditionally for private capital. And so that's had its challenges along the way. And we've seen sort of significant volatility around that track record I showed you over 15 years plus. As the share price looks a lot more wavy than that, that's for sure. And again, many of the people who are on the call today have benefited from and had challenges from that, not least the team and our investors. I think there's a couple of things. One is we know as a team that we can only have the impact that we've all got the ambition for if we make returns. That's just a fundamental fact. Now, the other thing is, of course, like a number of our investors and co-investors, we think those two things are intertwined. So it's not sort of one leads to the other one and the other. I think those two things are actually intertwined in impact and financial return. The things that we have tried to do over the years are increase scale in the business, therefore increase liquidity, and therefore hopefully make the share more attractive to a wider pool of investors. Certainly over the last 12, 18, 24 months, and this was a real team effort around the board, was to try to work out how do we make this stock as compelling as possible for as broad a group of investors as possible. We've got this amazing impact story, but there's been some challenges around who can actually hold the stock. So we've tried to move the model to one where if we can deliver those double-digit returns, but have an element of that in cash, both through a regular, modest but growing dividend and through a buyback strategy like the one that we are doing at the moment and allocating a portion of our realizations to returns, then that will hopefully start to mean that investors have confidence in holding this stock over the long term. So I think there's, of course, there's IR effort. Of course, as I said, earlier to you all, you are all friends, supporters of IP Group. You can help us to put us in contact with people who you think would be most aligned with the mission that we're on and the value that we're trying to create. We have a number of ideas on that front too, but ultimately we've got to deliver impact and we've got to deliver value. And who knows, maybe the next time we talk about unicorns, it will be measured not just in billion-dollar companies, but it will be, billion lives helped or saved, or it'll be a billion people protected from cybercrime, or whatever it will be. And I think, it's very interesting at COP to see the proposed formation of this International Sustainability Standards Board, and really trying to move market perception and value towards some of those impact measures. And, we are fantastically well placed for that, but we've got to get the share price to be an attractive investment for our shareholders.
I'll add just a tiny bit really shortly to that. I mean, for me, one of the key things is actually to keep performing, ultimately performance. We keep performing the way we have. And I personally believe our portfolio can continue to do so. In the end, it becomes impossible to ignore if we keep giving these returns. Secondly, I think by telling the story, keep telling the story. People haven't always heard it. They haven't always heard about IP Group. It's a fascinating story, but the company is also fascinating. So it's a great story to tell. So I think getting out and telling the story. And finally, producing really world-changing companies. They become increasingly hard to ignore because of a kind of conception to maturity nature of our whole model. Means that in the early days, often a lot of it's talking about hope and aspiration and dreams. But of course, increasingly now, the dreams are turning into reality. Some really serious companies. And I think the more we do that, the more people will sit up and listen. And I think that inevitably will impact upon the share price. But there's some more coming in, so I'll move on. Stefan, lovely to have you here. I've been reading your research note on ONT, an excellent note. Thank you very much. Here's a subject we have skirted around a little bit earlier, but we'll do it one more time. We'll start with you, Greg, again. So afternoon, folks. This is only if there is time on the agenda. There is. Can you refresh us on the status and importance of your university network, the IP Group story now? How does IP Group work with the various university tech transfer businesses? How important is this network to sourcing for IP Group? And how important is IP Group as a funding provider to the universities? As I say, Greg, we touched on it, but perhaps to you.
Yeah, I mean, again, we had a first pass of a board update on what the landscape is looking like for three of our key resources in IP Group: capital, talent, and sourcing. And sourcing was an area of hot debate around the table. And I don't think we see it as a challenge. But I think the important thing to note is that the way that we are sourcing is different in different territories and evolves as we have got experience in each of the different territories. So specifically in the UK, almost all of our university partnerships are now in the form of MOUs or loose relationships where we know through our networks and through our experts where we would like to spend our time. But we do also continue to interface with the tech transfer offices, and members of Mark, Rob, and Sam's team do interface regularly with the tech transfer offices. It's an important part of the bottom up. But increasingly, there is a focus on this sort of top down. Where do we think the real intersection of our strengths lie, and then proactively looking while having our eyes open for things that might bubble up to the surface. And it's different in different territories. The US is slightly different to this, and Australia is different again. And I think it's also worth saying it's places where research is carried out. So it may not just be universities. There, sourcing does not just have to come from universities, but the key thing is this sort of deep technical scientific backdrop. So I may well have said it all, but Mark, Rob, I don't know if you want to sort of either exemplify or add to how you both think about it.
No, I think that was a good summary.
Maybe just a couple of things. I mean, the UK has become it's moved on, right, as an environment in a good way. So we started the whole thing in 2001. I think universities have their own views on what they want, and these relationships are typically looser, are easier in some ways because there's no obligation on us to say yes or no. We're still doing it. We've got 2 new investments we're going to announce shortly, one from Oxford, one from Cambridge, in the areas I described earlier. So still seeing great science coming out of UK universities, but it's a different relationship now. And finally, to the point that Greg mentioned around other sources of IP. So the deal we announced at COP, kind of live with people there on this amazing way of making green ammonia a readily usable combustion fuel, that was STFC, so the people who run the ISIS neutron source, this huge national science asset, and Reaction Engines, which is itself as a big space exploration startup. They're doing world-class science at Reaction Engines, and pleasure to work with them. It's their first spin out. The fact that we had done something like 300 spin outs previously has been super helpful in that transaction. So we're looking for stuff more broadly, but the core skill set of recognizing world-class kind of, new research, engineering, science is the same. And it's that business building expertise that we're bringing to bear in those and these other new deals.
Thank you, everyone. And last, and at the moment, it does look like, at least, it looks like the final one. No, it wasn't. No one just come in. What looked like the final question was, will there be a plan to do another share buyback next year? That's in 2022. That's the anonymous attendee. Shall I perhaps kick off on that, then hand to Greg, if you'd like to comment? I think it's clearly an option. We are currently only sort of about halfway through the currently announced plan. We announced the plan up to about 35 million. We're about just under halfway through that now. Clearly, we'll obviously finish that program first, and then we'll consider our situation next year. We'll consider what's appropriate. Obviously, we're on a full capital allocation process. So in that, obviously, there's a relatively recently new dividend policies we've got share buyback. We've also got actual investment plans as well. So we will be considering all of those factors in this. Certainly wouldn't want to commit to one now, but clearly it's a tool we've now started using, and at the appropriate time, we'll probably use again. I don't know if you'd like to add to that, Greg.
I don't think our CFO could have said it any better.
Well done, CFO. Stefan, I think what looks like your last question, it isn't a question. Thank you, folks. Really helpful. Look forward to celebrating your anniversary in the flesh at a future date. Happy birthday. What a brilliant comment. I couldn't end it better. Thank you for that. So we really are now getting towards the end and winding up. So we're just going to run in a moment a few videos from some of our most successful CEOs of some of our most successful companies. And hopefully they reflect something I think we're most proud of. We're proud of that we join these companies often from the beginning, and we stay with them and alongside them, often alongside the management, all the way up from conception to maturity. And for that reason, we often build a very unique relationship, I think, with the management and management teams in these companies. And hopefully that's reflected in the sort of things they say about us, but also it's reflected hopefully in our understanding and commitment to the companies in our portfolio. So before I hand over to that, just for those that won't be with us at the end, I think at the end will just be a brief sign off. Just like to thank absolutely everybody who's come and joined us on this. As we said before, shame we can't all celebrate in person, but I'm sure we will do soon. And the first 20 years have been truly exciting and really quite remarkable. And I think absolutely everybody in IP Group is looking forward to the next 20 years. So we look forward to joining you all soon, and hopefully in the new year. Thank you for joining us. We'll hand you over to some of our leading CEOs.
Over the 15 years we've been around, you've been very supportive, you've helped us, advised us, invested in us, and this company would not be here today without your support.
We would not exist without IP Group's wherewithal and appetite to invest in technologies at a stage when nobody else would consider it.
First Light definitely would not have got off the ground without IP Group.
Without your unique business model and vision, companies like Mobiline would not exist. Game-changing technologies would never make it out of research labs, and the impact that those technologies have on people and society in general would fail to exist.
You have an absolutely brilliant team of people, and you're genuinely changing the world.
You have done an amazing job in the life sciences and other technical areas to bring IP out of universities and into products.
When I tell people about IP Group, I tell them that their competitive advantage is that IP Group actually understands science and actually understands technology. The conversations that I have with people at IP Group are an order of magnitude more advanced technically than with most other investors. And I think that's IP Group's key differentiator. Yes, it's investing in early stage technology out of universities. It's doing so, I think, with a keen understanding of the nature of science, the nature of innovation, the nature of technical progress. That's what's really unique about IP Group.
The backing you guys gave and the coaching and everything you did for Ceres was absolutely pivotal, really, in turning Ceres into the success it is today. So I owe you guys a huge debt of gratitude. It's been fantastic.
Intelligent Ultrasound, which was one of the first companies that span out of Cardiff University, and you have quite literally been with us every step of the way. You were there at the start, providing grub money, really importantly providing people, time and resources. You then provided us money so that we could grow.
IP Group has been the foundation of Diurnal's success. As a founder shareholder, they've been with us right from the beginning.
Keep going, keep pushing, and look forward to the next 20 years.
You should be very proud of everything that you've achieved, and keep up the great work.
No one does what IP Group does. When I explain Mobilion's company history or we hire a new employee, I make sure that I emphasize how lucky we are at Mobilion to have been given such a special opportunity.
Thank you, everybody. That's the cake we might have all been sharing together. I'm afraid now it's going to go to charity. But anyway, we'll find a good home for it. Many thanks, everybody. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. Goodbye.
Bye.